Welcome to That Implementation Science Podcast, the show that aims to increase the pre-implementation planning to sustainment rate to 16.5%. I'm your host, Mike Pullman, and on today's show, co-host Kevin King and I talk with Lisa Saldana about her work developing measures of implementation stages and costs, her fascinating and powerful data repository, and we quiz her on beautiful Eugene, Oregon. You know, I've always been impressed with Lisa's work, but after this interview, I left believing that she is doing some of the most interesting and most important research in implementation science today. Listen in and study up on her work, and I think you'll agree. Without further ado, let's get started. All right, everyone, welcome to That Implementation Science Podcast. I'm your host, Mike Pullman. I'm here with co-host Kevin King.
Hey, everyone.
And we are here talking today with Lisa Saldana. Lisa received her doctorate in clinical psychology from the University of Missouri-Columbia in 2003 and is active in the development, evaluation, and implementation of EBPs. She is a senior research scientist and the incoming research director of the Oregon branch of Chestnut Health Systems Lighthouse Institute and is the associate director of the National Lighthouse Institute. Lisa, it's so good to have you on the show. I think the last time that I saw you, you were playing Dungeons and Dragons at Cirque, isn't that right?
It's so nice to see you. Thanks for having me as well. Dungeons and Dragons at Cirque. I was probably doing some mischief at Cirque. So
How have you been? What have you been up to?
Trying to enjoy the summer. They're very gratefully, we have not been hit, and I'm sorry for part of the country that has been with the smoke. And so it's been really nice to be outside, get some time with the dog. And enjoying the weather here.
Well, that's great. You're in Eugene, Oregon, right? So I always think of Eugene as having really beautiful, pristine weather, a lot like Seattle in the summer for sure.
Yeah, no, we've been really fortunate this summer. I think you probably know the last few summers where we were not as much so really enjoying it this year. Yeah, and getting out there.
Nice. It's always nice to enjoy the sunshine and the heat. And then sort of like dry warmth before the smoke comes in, because invariably every year at some point in the Pacific Northwest, the smoke comes in, like as you said, as the rest of the country has been experiencing on and off all summer. Well, Lisa, maybe we could start by just telling us a little bit about how your career and how you found yourself to be where you are sort of now, transitioning this new exciting job.
Oh, wow. Yeah, thanks. So I don't know that the beginning of my implementation science career is that different from a lot of our colleagues and friends and all the people that are doing such amazing work out there. I originally wanted to be, and I still am, an intervention developer. And so when I went to graduate school, really what I was doing is I was looking to try and hope to develop some evidence-based practices and some innovations, in particular to help kids and families involved in the child welfare system. At that point in time, there was not a lot, and there still is not a lot in the grand scheme of things, of evidence-based work happening in that space. So my intention was and has always been to really help to create some achievable and feasible interventions that families could easily access. And so I went to graduate school to do that and I learned a lot of really, really great things from my mentor there, who was Lisette Peterson, around intervention development, and particularly in the prevention space. But then once I graduated and sort of got out of that really academic focused environment, it didn't take very long to realize that there are so many of these great innovations that have been created by really, really smart and well-intentioned and motivated individuals. But then those interventions don't really ever take off or actually get into the hands of the consumers and the families, and in the case of the work that I do, that really need to achieve that. I had the really great fortune of having a conversation with John Landsberg, who I'm sure many of your listeners are familiar with. John is one of the sort of folks that was on the cutting edge of thinking about implementation science, particularly when it comes to children's mental health. And in so doing, he really encouraged me to think about, at that time, that is when IRI, Implementation Research Institute, was getting off the ground. So we had folks like Enola Proctor, Greg Ahrens, Brian Mittman, and John, and others putting their heads together to sort of think about what would it look like to create a training program focused on implementation. And he really encouraged me to take advantage of the fact that these really great minds were getting together to do that. And so I fortunately took his advice and sought that opportunity out. And that's really what launched my implementation science career. Was I was already doing implementation work, but didn't have a network of folks to really help to support the work I was doing, bounce ideas off of. And I think you guys know, as the folks that are running this really cool podcast, that implementation science, it sort of skirts around services research, sort of skirts around intervention research. So other areas where I had the fortune of having expertise and really strong mentorship, but really pulling that all together to be able to create what I think we now know are some really consistently used, standardized implementation methods.
I really like that framework. That's really striking to me, that the idea that sort of, that implementation science pulls together threads from lots of different disciplines, like you said, from health services, from intervention. And I also like how you frame it as it comes from a place of need, right? You came out of your training, like a lot of us trained in clinical psychology, as an interventionist, right? Either as, we're all at least trained to deliver interventions, and some of us are trained to create them. And then you have this experience, which I think a lot of people have when they go into practice too, right? Of going out and say, okay, when I have this real person sitting across from me and I'm not in a training clinic and they're not pre-screened to meet my, the specific disorder that I'm trying to treat and add this protocol to, what do I actually do? But you're thinking of that same, how do I deal with this person in front of me? And you're thinking, how do I deal with this system in front of me and this system of people? I just love that description of like how the field and even being around early on sort of allowed you to network and pull expertise from a lot of different areas. I guess that leads to a question of how do you feel like from those early days in your career, what do you feel like what do you feel some lessons that you or maybe the field has broadly learned about how to encourage crosstalk and how to sort of pull those threads together more efficiently?
Oh, that's a really, really interesting question. Well, I think something that we all know, right? Partnerships and relationships are really important, and I think critical in this field. This is not a solo field. Like, if folks are interested in really like working individually, there are, of course, roles in implementation science where that little niche market could be useful, but it's a team science. This is like an all hands on deck sort of approach to doing the work. And so I think some of the lessons learned are around pulling those different threads are, we don't need to reinvent the wheel all of the time for every single new sort of branch of a field. I do think, I don't know that everybody in the IS world would agree with me on this, but I do think that there were some places early on where we were at risk for doing that, for sort of recreating some of the same things that other fields already had maybe not mastered, but at least had some, made some really good inroads on. And I do think that there were some points along the way and different people along the way that have pulled us from doing that. I do think that there are ways that we have learned about rigor and efficiency and sort of a rapid pace that we've learned more from the medical side of medical fields that we've been able to pull into the IS field that has been incredibly important. One of the key things that I was hearing early on, again, not rocket science and things that we all know, but some of the things that we were doing with the implementation science field, by trying to bring that scientific rigor to the process, what we were also doing is we were maybe making things more protracted than they needed to be. And we were not necessarily recognizing. And again, this is not everybody. So please, whoever's listening to this, please don't think this is everybody. I know that my team at least fell at risk sometimes of not being as responsive to the communities and to our constituents who are actually in need of whatever this thing is that we're trying to implement. And so what has been really useful, I think, is to see how we can bring those efficiencies, like I said, and the use of resources. How we can be effective in our use of resources to be able to maintain rigor and yet respond more rapidly than I know at least we certainly have in the intervention development field. And I think in the services research field, I think that there are real opportunities there in the IS world for us to be more responsive.
Man, I don't know, Lisa. I've always been of the opinion that science advances in 5-year increments. I don't know why 5 years just seems like a convenient number. Maybe it's related to the R01 funding cycle.
I was going to say maybe the funding cycles. Yeah.
Yeah. Every grant, every longitudinal study ever is we study people for 4 to 5 years. And we're like, well, I wonder why that is. No, I really appreciate that framing of like, how do you balance rigor with other important factors like, actually serving the community that you need. And that seems to also reflect your value of like, hey, let's establish relationships. And that relationships both with the community and the people who, are the end users of the intervention and benefit from it, but also from the other scientists in the field.
Yes. Yep. That's right.
Yeah, highlights for me a real need for implementation science to incorporate more methods from community-based participatory research, participatory action research, program evaluation. I've been doing this work for a long time, and those are all more from the side of involving community members in determining the stake of and the outcomes in implementation research, but also, I guess, on the other side, really borrowing a lot from replication science and the learnings that have been happening in social psychology. So I love the idea of balancing rigor and practice, and that really is the nexus of, or should be, in my opinion, the nexus of where implementation science should be. Now, one of the tools that you've created that I think has had a really large impact on the field and in helping stakeholders, whether they are researchers or implementers or community members, understand the process with which implementations occur is the stages of implementation completion measure. I'm wondering if you could just kind of describe that for our listeners that haven't heard of it before. What is it? Why is it useful? And
Yeah. Okay. So this seems like a simple question, Michael, and I could go on and on. I could talk for days about this. So the stages of implementation completion, or the SIC, is a tool that I think is super fun. Sometimes I describe it to people as the nerdy part of my job, because it's not something where we're going out into communities. In fact, what we are doing is we are working with other folks who are implementers who want to get something implemented, sometimes small scale. Sometimes folks are coming into this with the idea that we want to go big and we want to scale up. But what the SIC is it started out as basically a tracking tool, a tracking measure for us to be able to systematically assess what is necessary to be able to implement, in this case, evidence-based practice. And so originally this was designed as part of a head-to-head trial between two different blended implementation approaches. Where there are many different steps that were necessary to implement a single evidence-based practice. So this was part of an R01. Patty Chamberlain was the PI of that R01, and I had the really good and great fortune of being sort of tasked with developing this measure. My dissertation was on measurement development, and so I had some experience there. And so this is sort of my first big implementation science task, was to try and figure out, how do we measure implementation process? So in so doing, starting off basically by observing, right? Like, I am a behavioral psychologist by training. And so I like to observe and understand behaviors before we operate or operationalize anything. And so being able to see whether who are the different actors, what are the different strategies, what are the different steps, how long does it take for folks to really kind of just develop a recipe or a plan to be able to get some sort of an intervention into, again, the hands of the consumers, which is our ultimate goal. And so in doing that, we created the SICK, and the SICK started off as, I believe it started off with 16 stages, then we went to 14 stages, then we went to 12 stages, and ultimately through our psychometric analyses, we landed on 8 stages. Those 8 stages really help think about progressing from engaging with an intervention or innovation. So deciding, like, is this the right fit for us? And then moving through a process through the development of assuming that we say, yes, we do want to move forward with implementation. Then we need to, decide, is that implementation going to be feasible in our particular context? Then we need to see, like, what does it take to get ready? Like, what are all the different steps that we want to take to build the infrastructure? And then from there, obviously, we want to identify our clients. We want to hire our clinicians, our staff. We want to be able to hire them or assign them, allocate them, whatever that might be, depending on your circumstances, and train them. We want to get our fidelity monitoring systems in place. And then after all those things are done, then we can think about launching our program and starting to actually see clients. Prior to the work with the SICK, oftentimes folks begin their work with, I want to serve a client. And so all of that build up, that infrastructure, that assessment of feasibility, getting folks ready, those were things that people acknowledged and sort of nodded their head to, like, okay, the agency is going to have to get ready. And then they'll start working with us and we will launch the program. What the SICK really did is, I guess I should go on to say there are a few more stages after launch. So then you launch, and then then we do ongoing monitoring of quality through fidelity monitoring, and then we achieve our competency so that we can go into sustainment and meet our sustainment goals. So there are 8 stages overall. But prior to this, where I was going before, is folks really started about, like, I'm interested in launching the program, but not what does it take to actually build the infrastructure, identify the resources, have things in place for that launch point. Again, the SICK was built as a tracking tool. So first, all we were doing is tracking, what did it take to get these programs in place? Well, as we were doing that, we're like, there's some consistency to what needs to be done to be able to get these things in place. I had the really good fortune after that first grant where we developed this to then receive some independent R01 funding, where I was able to develop a full SICK team. We were able to then understand the scoring behind all of this, come up with validation protocols, and really grow the SICK to be more than a tracking measure, but now instead to be a measurement tool. We had psychometric properties around that. We have, like, again, sort of training processes around how to implement and use the SICK. And then, as if that wasn't great enough for us to be able to now measure implementation, not just track implementation, because there was such a dearth in the field and there was such a need for a measure like this, I just feel so privileged and thankful to all of my colleagues worldwide who said, let's go ahead and start using this tool as well. Because what that allowed us to do then is to develop a data repository of different implementations that have taken place around a whole range of different types of innovations and interventions. Because we have that repository, that then has grown the SICK to be what Michael and Kevin, I think you guys think of the SICK being today, which is more of a predictive tool. And we have, like, predictive algorithms underneath it. We can now use it to sort of guide and provide prospective direction towards what would we recommend for a successful implementation process. So the SICK is not just I know you asked a simple question, but it has really morphed over time in a way that it now can be used in several different ways. Some people still want to use it simply as a tracking tool. Some people want to use it simply as a measure, but a lot of folks are now using it more prospectively to guide where are their pain points in their implementation process, being able to identify and predict where we're going to have some difficulties, being able to, launch that program. And once we do, being able to help keep our agencies or our sites on course so that we actually do get to sustainment. And we have seen that by doing that, we are increasing sustainment rates significantly for agencies that do use that process.
That is so cool. So cool. So you have this system-wide measure that shows that the stages of implementation or that people can use to track their stages of implementation, and you're able to actually then harness that data to examine which elements may be more associated with implementation or not.
That's right.
And it does go back, like the foundation of implementation science is this kind of oft-cited claim that most implementation efforts fail, right? You see that cited all the time. Now, if you go back and track that original citation, the original citation doesn't exactly say that. It's a hard citation to dig up. And the evidence for it is actually
and it's 14%. Don't forget the 14% is also very important. Yep.
Well, the evidence for it is actually fairly weak, but no longer, because you have, for at least for people using this measure, you can actually track people's implementation success. In fact, you have a paper that just came out with Zoe Ali as a lead author. I'd love if you could talk about that a little bit. That's the relative value of pre-implementation stages for successful implementation of evidence-informed programs. Can you tell us a little bit about what you found there? I'm sorry, because my assumption is that data was pulled from your tracking system, correct?
You are absolutely correct. That's right. And I also, before we go there, I just want to also do a little shameless plug for another junior person who's been working with me. His name's Dylan Wong. And 2 years ago, or I should look up the citation before I start speaking, but he actually published a paper from that repository as well, because the data was pulled at a different time, slightly different than the paper you're talking about with Zoe as the lead author. But that's a paper where he looks at sustainment rates and looks at sustainment. And so to your point, he did empirically show that the majority of implementations across this repository, they do unfortunately not make it. And that happens both in terms of getting to launch, but then even those that do launch, those that make it to launch have a much, much greater chance of making it to sustainment, but only, and then this feeds into the Ali paper, only if they've done a good quality job with pre-implementation. So
just can I just clarify that then, Lisa?
Of course, yeah.
That seems to imply that like everybody who contributed data to this repository is already focused on implementation, right? They're implementation scientists or others. So you have you already have a Bergson's bias here, and that you have an incredibly biased sample.
That is absolutely right.
Which, I mean, just, which is then implying that if you're saying, okay, from these data, from people who care.
Even from those, yes.
Right. So the inference to me then is that in the real world, across all sorts of agencies and all sorts of settings, that, if we assume that people who contribute data to this repository are a committed minority of people interested in doing things well and implementing to the best of ability, that suggests that even higher percentage of programs that people set out to implement end up failing because they're not even thinking about implementation. That's just a little depressing to think about.
That is a little depressing. And I think that you're right. I think that that's probably a hypothesis that would be supported if we were able to dig into that. But I think where we have hope, so let's not get hung up on it. Is depressing, but I think that there are lots of opportunities for hope, and that sort of feeds into Michael's question in terms of the paper that Zoe Ali is first author on. And so in that paper, what we were able to show is that, again, we can think of it on the flip side of being depressing, or we can think of it on the side of we've got information now, empirical evidence that really shows us what are the key parts of the implementation process that are necessary to support a program and sustainment. And so one of the things that came out of that paper was showing, anybody who saw it might recognize the graphs. Those are graphs that we've been presenting on for a very, very long time, and kept expecting the graphs were going to change as we got more data. So we didn't want to publish it, right? But it's like, nope, it's very, very consistent findings. And so the consistent finding is that each of those pre-implementation stages, so the engagement process, the assessment and consideration of feasibility, and the readiness planning stage, each of those are distinct stages. So yes, we do talk about pre-implementation, but each of those add their own independent value to the implementation process. One of the other things that I think is striking about that information is the engagement part, which is what we as a field do less so now, but still I think do, unless you are one of the people you're talking about who are really motivated and dedicated to implementation. Oftentimes, what do? We build this program. We tell people about the program. We tell people this program is the program for you. Yep, you've got this problem. This is, we're going to be able to help you do that. And yet at the same time, the program then doesn't really take off. One of the things that the data in that paper shows is engagement and information alone does not get us to sustainment. It might get us to launch. It's not going to get us to the point where we need to sustain. It often doesn't get us to launch though either. If we look at feasibility and like we're assessing whether or not something is feasible, that increases our chance that yes, we are going to get a sustainable program. But it's really that readiness planning phase. And we all here, I mean, gosh, we talk about readiness planning like ad nauseum, right? So I really think I worry that because we talk about readiness planning ad nauseum, it has now become maybe a watered down version of what it needs to be. And what we've really shown empirically here is that there are some key readiness activities that if done and if done well, and done at a good pace, because part of what the SIC does that I didn't really talk about is measured timing, and done at a good pace, that sets the stage for a sustainable program. What it also sets the stage for is a program being able to weather challenges that are, of course, going to happen in the implementation process. So if we have, at its most simple term, if we have two agencies, and both agencies launch, they both are serving the target population. One agency has a really strong pre-implementation and one agency does not. The agency that does not has a much less likely chance of developing a program that's going to sustain into the future. But not only that, it has a less likely opportunity that when there are challenges along the way, that they're going to be able to handle them. And that's what we see is that it's pretty remarkable when we see, again, and the paper doesn't go into this in that much detail, but we have instances where we have agencies or sites or circumstances where you're like, oh my God, they are tanking and they are tanking really quickly. But if you look back and they have a strong pre-implementation, they are able to write the course again and get back on track. Whereas those that don't have that strong pre-implementation, if things like funding's getting pulled, you have a lot of staff turnover, you have COVID, you have like all these different sort of outer context factors, without a strong pre-implementation, those sites don't maintain.
That's so fascinating. I think that, well, the byline for that implementation science podcast is that we are reducing the innovation to implementation gap to 16 and a half years, but I think we might need to change it to increasing the pre-implementation to sustainment uptake to 16.5%. We'll get up two percentage points maybe. Really, really cool. I wonder too, are you finding that, are you able to really look at whether there are sort of different patterns or clusters in sort of types of implementation? Like, are there, because I imagine there's different kind of approaches that organizations take where they may leave certain strategies behind or not consider them, and that there may be sort of clusters, and then maybe sort of more effective clusters than others, or is it too early for this?
I think, yes, the short answer is yes, we are looking at those things and we are, I don't know that I would, say with 100% confidence, not that I would ever say anything with 100%, but I wouldn't say that we've got that figured out. But absolutely, what comes out of that paper is that there is variation amongst the types of programs and what their implementation process looks like. So the type of EBP that is being implemented, we absolutely know that the location and the site and the context influences what those processes look like. We have what's called the universal SIC, which is a set of 46 items that we sort of universally think are needed regardless of what is being implemented and regardless in what context. Even within those 46 items, when we go to some lower resource countries or we're working with different types of innovations, some of those 46 items are not always completely applicable, but there are other implementations that are far more complex. And so We have more and more, and what I've been having a lot of fun with lately, this is where the nerdy fun part comes in. I've been having a lot of fun is really looking at these multi-system, multi-layer, multi-complex implementations. And so when we're working with, you have to go into a state first and then go into a particular system within that state. And then that state like that system has different maybe units or bodies within it. And then you have to go down to, like a county level, and then like agencies within that county. So we're really layering multiple implementations on top of one another to get to our major implementation of, whatever it happens to be like. So like in my case, it might be an intervention across different counties with different child welfare agencies. But in order to get there, that pre-implementation process is so much longer than what we see when we're just sicking a single intervention. And part of that is because we are really doing a sick on top of a sick on top of a sick on top of a sick, right? And so what we do not know yet, but what I'm fascinated by is what it looks like we're kind of finding is that when we layer these sicks on top of each other, that although the overall process is much longer, depending on what it is we're implementing, each of those micro sicks that are layered on top of each other, though the timing and the scores, I guess the 6 scores, those are not really showing as much variation as I might have thought. So I think that it's that unimplementation process, again, although the grand thing might require 7 implementation processes, like in order to get the whole thing, but each individual process does seem to still have some systemization to it that I'm finding really fascinating. And maybe a year from now can come back and talk to you guys as we learn more about that.
One of the things, Lisa, that's striking me as I'm hearing this now, my background is in clinical psychology and in substance use research, and I got a lot of training in motivational interviewing. So a lot of this stages of implementation completion, the thing I'm going to ask you about, it just reminds me a lot of how we think about behavior change in general, right? That you sort of want to that people, before they change a behavior, they think about it a lot, they're ambivalent, they do a lot of preparatory work, and that preparatory work is important towards showing, is important for people to effectively change, right? They have to know what's going to work for them. They have to know their specific barriers or specific strategies. We can't just hand somebody a diet plan or an exercise change plan or a, quit smoking plan and just expect it to work. Everything has to be idiosyncratic and to them, idiosyncratic to them. One of the things I'd like to hear more about is something that's also we think a lot about when we think about individual behavior change is not only do people change because they see benefits, but whenever they make a change, they also see costs, right? So if somebody's, changing their diet or changing a substance use behavior, they lose something from that. And the saying that we have sort of in the motivational interviewing framework is, or the framework I guess we have is that people are ambivalent, right? And if people are not changing, there's a good reason why not. So you have this measure, the COINS, or the cost of implementing new strategies measure. Tell us about it. Like, how is it used? So why is this useful? Give us sort of our listeners an introduction to this measure and where it comes from and the ideas of it.
Sure. So first of all, Kevin, I just want to say thank you. You have just made my day and made me so happy because the way that you just described implementation and implementation process change is exactly the way I think about it. I am a behavioral psychologist by training, and that is, I absolutely think about this in terms of organizational behavior and in terms of organizational cost for organizational behavior. So you could not have teed this up more, better. COINS. So the cost of implementing new strategies actually does, it's an adjunct to the SICK. And so, as I mentioned before, the SICK is this 8-stage tool where we operationalize the implementation process. What I didn't go into is within each of those 8 stages are a number of strategies that are tailored specifically to the thing that we are trying to implement, right? And so it might be that we have to hire a supervisor for, for one, we might say that we're hiring a supervisor, and another, they might use the word boss. And so, we come up with, we customize it to whatever the intervention is. But the idea is within each of those 8 stages, there are these activities. each of those activities, to perform those activities, have some level of costs to them. So you pointed out some of them, like there are some direct costs, actual like fixed fees that need to go into something. Let's say I have to, all of my interventions are video recorded. And so I need to install cameras in all of my treatment rooms, and I need to set up some sort of a networking. So there's a direct cost to that. But then there's also the cost of the human time that it takes to do something. And if you are an executive director of an agency and you are bringing in a new evidence-based practice, your time's already paid for, right? You're on a full-time salary. But what we want to understand is what are the costs that you could be doing something else with that time. So what is the cost that you are putting forth towards this particular implementation? In addition, what oftentimes we find gets overlooked is non-dollared, but yet resource personnel costs. A lot when we go into like our mom and pop shops and we go into our smaller agencies, even our larger agencies, a lot of what is done in that initial building the infrastructure, that pre-implementation phase that oftentimes gets overlooked, that is done a lot of times by volunteers. Those are people who are volunteering their time. And so if we were to go out and want to replicate this in another community, and I tell you that it only costs $5 because I only had to like go get one cord to plug in my already existing network, well, that's absolutely not going to tell you the actual cost to implement this. So what we are oftentimes looking for is we're looking for the cost of replication to be able to implement something when we think of coins. So what we're looking at is we're looking at labor costs. We're looking at even if there aren't, again, dollars associated with it, but number of hours that are spent. Who are the most optimal people to spend those hours? And then we are looking at, of course, direct costs and sort of fixed costs that come along with implementing any sort of evidence-based practice. What we do is we're able to do that. We're using the coins approach, similar to SICK, over the time of building this evidence-based practice. A lot of times when people say, and this is what we heard, so this coins was built from a wealth of qualitative information that we learned after talking to a bunch of leaders who had implemented in different contexts. And what they said is that was frustrating to them is that at the outset, they're told some specific things. You're going to need this number of people. You're going to need this amount of dollars. It's going to take this amount of time. They would pony that up, and then poof, everybody just disappears. And now they're working with the frontline clinicians that are doing the intervention. But the people who like made the decision to make this investment oftentimes are left out of the process at that point. Using coins allows us to be able to map out how these resources are used over the course of the implementation process and feed that information back to those decision makers so that they can see, are we using our resources not like in one big purchase, but over time, how are we developing our capacity? How are we growing our referral base? And what is the resource that it takes to do those sorts of implementation activities? Because I might want to use that again later for something else I'm implementing. What it also does is it allows the smaller agencies or less well-funded agencies to be able to see that implementing something is achievable. I oftentimes think back, this was some years back, but I had a state leader call me and say, hey, what do you think about doing XYZ intervention? We really want to do the evidence-based one, but the evidence-based one's too expensive. So we're thinking about doing this other non-evidence-based practice. And it struck me that decision maker was making their decision based purely off of some sort of market value price that somebody had told them. The actual cost to develop and grow and do their own thing would be so much higher than doing something that was already prepackaged. It's not going to be cheaper if you are doing something that is not evidence-based. And in fact, now you are spending resources on something that we don't even know if it's going to work, right? And so it could be that those resources are lost entirely. So coins allows the decision maker to see how their implementation costs and resources are being used over time, to be able to make decisions over time and in their future when they want to replicate something. It's also lets them say, like, okay, we don't have the budget for the full deal. You told me this is going to cost me $300,000. I don't have $300,000. But now that I can see the phasic way in which we're going to approach this, we have $80,000 for this year. And that's how much it's going to cost for me to do these 2 phases or stages of the implementation process. And now we can go ahead and budget another $40,000 to do those next 2 stages. So it makes implementation not only more achievable, but it helps people sort of like outline with clear expectations what is going to be demanded, not just from their money, but also from the number of hours and personnel costs.
I love this because it brings such a real world perspective, or a grounded perspective to how these programs actually get off the ground and how change actually happens, like you said, at an organizational level, right? And all of us know, I think from personal experience, that if we just set a goal in mind, like, I'm going to do this differently, I'm going to watch less TV, I'm going to drink less beer at night, I'm going to exercise more, just those vague sort of self-change goals, they're not likely to happen. And the parallel here is this state leader saying, well, I'm going to either buy, this package of TFCBT, or we're going to make our own intervention and we're going to develop it ourselves. And look, this one's cheaper than this other. And I'm just so impressed by the work you're doing, because you're sort of the person saying, okay, wait, let's hold on. Let's think about all of this realistically, think about how do we, everything, and let's think about all of the things that lead up to successful sustainment, both how do we do all of the planning phases well? How do we think about, as we're going through all those planning phases, how do we think about what are not only what's it going to take, but how is this costing us? And again, it's so important to be thinking about, how does this cost us, not just in terms of money, as our economics colleagues would like us to reduce everything to. And I say that partly sarcastically, but also, what are the other costs? What are the personnel costs? What are the emotional costs of trying something new? What are the sort of, like you said, the cost of the volunteer time to do this, and sort of helping people think through. And then, as you've said over and over and over in this interview, how do we think about these things as a process over time? This isn't a one-shot deal, that if we really want to take this seriously, you keep emphasizing, like, we really have to be thinking about this over time. And it just seems to me like such a wonderful resource for people that you've been doing this work, outlining, you and your colleagues outlining, like, hey, to have this stuff be successful, we need to think about these as a process that unfolds over time, that has to be sort of thoughtful and careful, and really think about all the things we have to do to set ourselves up for success.
Yeah, really nice summary. Thank you. Yeah, that's you said it much faster than I did. See, efficiency.
I'm using all of my motivational interviewing skills. I believe that was a good example of a summary statement. If anybody out there wants to code me on a mighty.
Let's talk about some of those intangible costs. So, and as the coins, I don't know if the coins is able to actually capture some of those. And I'm specifically thinking about just like the emotional costs that come up, just the costs of either inertia or changing momentum, right? Somebody's doing one thing, maybe they need to de-implement that thing in order to do another thing. The sort of social and political capital that's necessary to expend in order to get people on board, for leaders to sort of shift their attitudes to get them to do something. Is this something that the coins can track in some way, or are you able to begin to think about some of these intangible costs in a way that can help decision makers make better decisions?
Yeah, it's a great question. And unfortunately, my answer is no. The coins itself is really focused on number of hours and number of dollars. It's really focused on that. That being said, for the sick, Michael, I know this is not what you're asking me about, but we do have a module that is our outer context module. The outer context module allows us to be able to pinpoint in the implementation process when something happens that might be one of these more intangibles that you're talking about. So we have somebody who, I don't know, is we're relying on a system leader, and that system leader is feeling really burnt out right now and took a 2-month leave of absence or something. So when we have those, so there's still, it's not quite as intangible as you're talking about, because we want to be able to put some brackets around it, put some parameters around it. But if we're able to say that something started in May and lasted until July, that's just an example. Things sometimes start and they never end. We have a way of putting that within the SIX system as an outer context factor. And we track that along with the implementation process so that we see the impact that then has on things like the amount of time, right? And so I wouldn't be able to say there's a particular individual who's really motivated and increasing the inertia like you're talking about, but I would be able to say if somebody came on the outside and started doing motivational interviewing with that particular individual to help increase their momentum and the inertia, and then the impact that has on the implementation. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that totally makes sense. Totally makes sense.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we're going to do a little bit of a hard shift. There's been a lot of buzz lately on our podcast about the paper that you wrote with Renaud Betis and
Renad and Rachel Shelton.
Thank you. Yes, Rachel Shelton. And in this paper, you really are encouraged. It's a very short paper, quick read. You're encouraging the field to jump straight into effectiveness trials and implementation trials for mental health evidence-based practices, in particular in situations where safety is not a concern. And just kind of curious if we could talk about this paper a little bit, because people have been talking about it so much. What prompted you to write this paper, and what do you hope to achieve?
Oh, gosh. Well, I will say what prompted us to write the paper. This has been a paper in the making for years, as many papers are. This is really something that we have all believed in for a long time. And I think it's first of all, it's fun, right? It's fun to get to write with your friends and your colleagues. And both Rachel and Renad are very, very dear friends and colleagues. I respect them tremendously in the work that they do. And in our individual conversations, so many of us had been talking a lot about what you had mentioned before, that 17-year, pipeline that we think about for implementation, and wanting to reduce that to more than 16 and a half. We want to reduce it even less than that. And that in some ways, because circling back to what Kevin was talking about, research happening in these 5-year cycles with, somewhat dependent on projects and grants, really, if we're going to reduce that timeline from 17 years, we need to think about doing our science differently. And we need to think about how much, who made these rules, right? Who sort of made the rules that we go from pilot first to then efficacy to then effect. There are very good reasons why we need to do that, particularly when we think about clinical trials and drug pharmaceutical trials, like you had mentioned, Michael, where safety is a concern. But where safety isn't a concern, we've been really fortunate with the hybrid trial designs that have come out in this last decade, where we can start to consider clinical effectiveness at the same time that we are considering implementation effectiveness. And so if we pilot something and we have a good sense that it's not going to do harm, and in fact, in some situations, anything is better than nothing. Not always the case, but sometimes the case, right? So when we have these types of interventions, rather than seeing how does this intervention hold up in a really rigorous, controlled environment where we are never going to actually deliver it that way in the real world, how about skipping forward and seeing what is it like to deliver it in the conditions in which it's going to be delivered? If something is effective in that more sterile, rigor environment, that's still not helping us achieve our goal of being able to deliver something and increase adoption rates or increase rates of somebody, getting the jab in the arm. And so really what we want to do is we want to reduce the steps necessary to be able to consider something to have enough evidence and rigor behind it. And we also want to be able to spend more of our time and more of our sort of both academic resources and the funding resources that we have focused on no, we want to understand what it looks like we want to understand what it looks like in the context that the population is going to receive it. And so that's really what the paper is about. The paper is about how can we, one, reduce that timeline, and do so by bringing, elevating and sort of highlighting how we can do just as rigorous if not more rigorous trials if we get them into the real world faster.
Yeah, it's so fantastic. It's one of those conversations that I've had in conference hallways a million times. And I think the field is so thankful for you all writing this, because now we have something to cite, right? And that can oftentimes provide, evidence or support when we're trying to make an argument. Shannon Dorsey pointed out when she was on the show that back in 2005, John Weiss and Amanda Jensen and Bryce McLeod wrote a really nice paper about when you're designing interventions to really be working on this, what they call a deployment focused model. So designing them for the real world, not designing them for efficacy per se. I mean, obviously you need effectiveness in the real world, but including that in part of your design considerations. And so now your paper has the sort of second half of this, which is not just designing for the real world, but actually planning these real world studies from the get-go. And I think it makes so much sense, because if it's not going to be effective in the real world, why even do it? We can come up with a highly efficacious study that could either never be delivered in the real world or be far too expensive. And what's the point of that? Yeah, that's great.
Yeah. But thank you. I don't think I was aware that paper is getting a lot of traction. So that's nice.
Well, it's getting traction with both of our listeners on the podcast.
Great. Wonderful.
There are dozens
of our
listeners. Dozens, Mike. So we're going to take another hard turn and go into our quiz. Now, I don't know if you know we're doing a pop quiz, and you should know. So hopefully, I don't want to put too much pressure on, but so we have a quiz for you about a topic that we hope is near and dear to your heart and that you are well educated on. But I will say, as a longtime participant in this podcast, we are not always great at targeting the difficulty of these quizzes. So I'm just going to give you a sort of a.
It's okay. I can be humble when I fail this quiz. Okay, let's go.
And so if I just want to say, you do get a prize if you win. The prize is that I will write your next out of office message, and to whet your appetite. Apparently, I have somewhat of a reputation for irreverent out of office messages. So the last one I wrote for our last winner, which was Danny Almiral.
Nice.
Was okay. So I gave him two. Here's one of them. I wrote, I'm out of town for a short trip to the beautiful town of Evanston, Illinois, to visit Northwestern University. It's called Northwestern because, well, I don't know, because it's actually right about the median center line of the population of the United States. It's neither northern nor western, but somebody decided they'd apparently just like to pretend that it's both, because I guess that'll make it more interesting. I'm guessing I won't be finding that out during my trip either, so don't expect enlightenment on that front. Just expect a delay in my replies to your email. So
lovely. Well, Danny is a very hard act to follow. So we'll see if I can win like he did. So yeah.
And actually that's good. She, for those of you who are not watching the video feed of our podcast, which is all of you, that win was in quotes, because the other thing to know is that the scoring on these quizzes is a little bit, as many of our measures, as you know, you're a measure developer, it's not consistent with all the other ways we measure things in the real world. So you're going to get a variety of response options. So I'll kick us off with the first one. The first one, Eugene, Oregon and Seattle, Washington share a nickname. What is it?
Something about Emerald.
Yes, the Emerald what?
The Emerald Valley?
So close.
Close.
We'll give you half credit, the Emerald City.
Oh, yeah. Well, we are in the Emerald Valley. So
yes.
How's that?
Oh, there you go. So you're scoring on that. That was actually on a 4-point Likert scale from not at all to very much. I'm going to give you a somewhat for that. So nice work. Now there's a bonus. You could increase your score from a somewhat to a very much if you get this one right. What is another nickname for Eugene?
Tracktown USA.
Good. The one Mike wrote down Track City, but I think Tracktown USA. That sounds much more accurate. I'm sure that's
It's what's
the
on all of the
non-Wikipedia.
murals around
Yes.
town. So there you go.
Fantastic. All right. Well, you just improved your score from a somewhat to a very much. All right, Mike, take the next question.
Very nice. All right, you're proving your residency in Eugene. That's great. So those of us who live in the Pacific Northwest know that Matt Groening, who obviously is the creator of The Simpsons, that Matt Groening is from Portland, Oregon, and he drew inspiration from many of his characters and landmarks from the Pacific Northwest. We'd like you to name the real-life tavern in Eugene that served as the inspiration for Moe's Tavern.
I did not even know such a thing existed. I thought you were going to ask me about the horse across the bridge that they have on The Simpsons.
Ooh, tell us about that.
Well, there's a stone horse like this guy, like on The Simpsons when it starts off. Yeah, that really is across the bridge when you go into Springfield from Eugene.
The statue.
The statue really is there. That's what I thought you were going to, and I thought I was going to know this answer. Moe's Tavern is, I don't know. I'm going to have to go with Moe's Tavern.
I'll give you a hint. It does start with an M, and it is 3 letters, and it is somebody's name. See how well you know the taverns in Eugene.
Apparently not well.
Nope.
I know the breweries in Eugene.
Yeah.
I would have to say, I don't know, Mac, just because we have Mac Court. So that's
good try. It's Max's Tavern.
Max's Tavern. Okay. Nope. Sorry. I totally bombed that one. Okay.
That's all right. That's all right.
All right. Well, that was scored on a range of 23 to 240 hours, which comes from your paper on the coins, which was the range of hours for the community development team that it took across sites. And I'm going to give you a score of 50 hours for that. Nice work. Nice work. Okay. Ken Kesey was the author of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest and a leader of the Merry Band of Pranksters, a group of hippies that traveled around the country in an old psychedelic painted school bus. What was the name of that bus and where is it currently located?
Oh, come on, you guys. I thought you were going to ask me about Sometimes a Great Notion. And now we go into the school bus. Where is the school bus? I do not know. I have been to the home because it is now a little retreat center, an artist retreat center. I don't believe that there's a school bus parked out there though. I don't know where the school bus is. I have no idea. I would say I don't know, Florence on the coast somewhere. I have no idea.
Okay, so our current understanding is that the bus's name is Further, and it's currently located at Ken Kesey's farm outside of Eugene.
Oh no, that's where I was. So that is where I was. That is the retreat center I've been.
Yeah. So my understanding is that it's kind of being reclaimed by the woods right now.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. Well, I have been there, and that is, I think I should get points for the retreat center because that's what I was thinking.
Unfortunately, that was a binary question, yes, no. And I think in the light of rounding, we're going to have to give you a no for that one. But that's okay because right now your score is a very much plus 50 hours plus no. So I think you're actually doing quite well.
Yeah, there's a really fun documentary that came out maybe 7 years ago about the Ken Kesey bus trip where they pulled together all the old footage.
They play it there. They play it at the Ken Kesey Center. They have it there. Nice, and the Ken Kesey Center, it's definitely worth going to. It's lovely. And there's a lot of original stuff. You can see where they also got very creative during their time there with the floors and with the walls and with it's fun. It's a really nice place.
I have to check it out.
Beautiful garden.
Last question. Speaking of hippies, when was the last Grateful Dead show in Eugene? Was it A, June 17th, 1996, B, June 17th, 1995, or C, June 17th, 1994, or D, no one remembers, man?
I'm sure somebody has that logged. I like your last one. Gosh, Grateful Dead. 95 maybe?
Oh, good try. It was 1994.
It was 94.
There is a bonus question that you can maybe pull this out. Was it Mike or Kevin who attended that show?
Man, y'all have good poker faces, both of you, perfectly. I'm gonna go with Kevin. Oh, darn it. I thought because you asked the question, you were trying to trick me.
It's my shaved head, isn't it? You're like, no way he was at a Grateful Dead show.
No, I was more like, he's not going to ask the question if he's the one that's the answer. All right, guys. So trivia, you might want to ask me to participate in some sort of implementation trivia, but like actual, real world trivia night where we're like somewhere playing, with beers. I am not the person you want on your team.
Yeah, I have to say this whole podcast is actually just screening for the next implementation conference. We're trying to develop our trivia team, and it's very helpful along these lines. Now, I'll say I have 2 comments here. June 17th is my daughter's birthday, so that is very exciting. To think that she was born 25 years after the Dead played in Eugene. So I took your scoring from 0 to 63 from the Beck Depression inventory, and you did get the year off by just 1 year, and you did get the date and month correct. So I'm going to give you a score of 20, which is just above the cutoff for moderate depression.
I was not ready to say I'm in the moderate range.
Yes, you're in the moderate range. I will give you moderate. So congratulations, actually, with the score of moderately depressed, no 50 hours, and very much. You actually have 1 hour prize. So next time you go out of town, or just next time you just can't keep up with your email and you need a good out of office message, send me a short email and I will write you an out of office message at no cost to you. The only cost is really your self-respect and that of the people emailing you. But you can help us.
So I'll be reaching out to you in a couple hours. Okay.
Absolutely. I have a quick turnaround on these things. That's the best way I can do is fast. So we're just about wrapping up the show here. We've been so grateful to have you on. Before you go, we want to hear from you. What are one or two of the most important implementation science publications that you feel any budding implementation researcher should know?
Most important is hard because there are so many really, really important pieces of work out there and so much amazing stuff done by our colleagues. I would say, though, if you're budding and we're just sort of an emerging implementation scientist, where I often send people to is, for the name of it, do you guys know what I'm talking about? The implementation sort of primer that is put together by NCI. And so that is let me see if I can pull this up real quickly. It is called.
And that's the National Cancer Institute.
Right. I'm sorry. And I should know this. This is not that challenging. It's called Implementation Science at a Glance. And so this is a really, really great resource. I have shared this resource with many, many folks who are entering into the implementation science field. And they have found it really useful. Folks who are writing grants for the first time, sort of understanding our language, understanding our need for frameworks, theories, models, the things that are really important to IS scientists. So I would say that this is anybody who is entering into the field. If you're new to the field, then this would be absolutely one.
Fantastic. I'll just, for everyone listening at home, I'll put that in the show notes. And so again, for any of you who is budding or emerging or molting even into implementation science, you'll be able to find that workbook in our show notes.
Yeah, and then this other one I think is one that, I'm sure some of your other guests have mentioned before, but it's again, for folks who are newly in the field, but the practical implementation science textbook that we have, the Moving Evidence into Action, Brian Weiner, Carl Lewis, and Ken Schurer. I think that this is one that I've shared with many, many folks. It's now something that we have for all of our postdocs and for new folks who are entering into our lab. Everybody finds it really easy. It's nice, pragmatic, gives some really, really complicated concepts a fair shake understanding, because I think the authors throughout for all the chapters did such a really, really nice job of simplifying these really, really complex ideas.
That's great. That is a good book. I second that, and I'll go check out the NCI document. I haven't looked at that before. Do you have any shout outs to any special people in your work or personal life?
Oh gosh. Well, anybody who knows me knows that I will always do a shout out to Mr. Banksy, my dog, who is my co-pilot in all things implementation science, and even not just my co-pilot in life. So always give a shout out to him. But and I just think I don't want to name anybody individually. I just feel like we are so incredibly fortunate. I am privileged that you guys even asked me to come on here and talk with you. I love our field. I feel so thankful that I got to be a part of the field when it was really first starting, because that means that our networks, as you guys know, they just go so much beyond any of our individual institutions or labs. And so I would just say, I mean, I guess I should do, a big shout out to the folks who got me into the field to begin with. So again, we're talking about John Lansford, Enola Proctor, Brian Mittman, David Chambers, those folks who really took the time and invested in what I had at that point, which was not a lot, and really helped with their time and patience to help shape into what I'm hoping is now trickling down and helping others in the field as well. So thanks.
I have to just jump in. I'm especially impressed. You're probably the first guest we've had who has not mentioned Brian Weiner, so I want to give you bonus points for that. Every time we ask that question, it's like a broken record.
It's
she
not
already
that
mentioned.
I was gonna say, it's not that I don't love Brian, and I mentioned him with the book.
Yeah, she already mentioned him in the book.
That's true. He already is. Okay. So at some point we have to get Brian on and see who he wants to shout out, because I'm tired of this network model all pointing in one particular node.
I also want to give just one, I didn't mention, because she was not my primary mentor, but also somebody who has just been is Jo Kirshner. And so I also want to acknowledge her as well. She's been an IRI mentor of mine over time, was not there when I was at the beginning, but we definitely have grown together over time. So I don't want to forget her either.
No, that's great. This list of acknowledgements really reflects, I think, your values of the importance of connection in this science and the importance of how much we can learn from each other. Well, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. It's just been a really enlightening and exciting conversation. If people wanted to find you, how would they reach you? Are you on social media? Should they just Google you and find you that way? What's the best way for people to reach out?
Currently right now with the transition that I'm very excited about, I don't think any of the above it actually is going to work. I do not do social media, as anybody who knows me already is aware. But if you Google me, it's probably going to have my old contact information. So if I could just say it out loud real quickly, is that okay?
Yeah, go ahead.
So my new email address for folks who are interested, it's first initial L, last name Saldana, all one word. So L Saldana @chestnut.org. And I am accepting emails there now live. So please feel free to use that.
That's great. And just one quick note for any editors or associate editors listening at home: if you want to send review requests to Dr. Saldana, you can send it to Lisa S at oslc.org. That's again, Lisa S at oslc.org for anyone who wants Lisa's help reviewing a paper. I'm sure she'll happily get back to you very quickly.
All right, Lisa, it was so much fun having you on the show. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you.
Thanks so much for listening. If you like today's show, post about it on social media, like, subscribe, share it with your friends and colleagues, or paint an old school bus with psychedelic colors, name it That Implementation Science Bus, and dump it on Ken Kesey's farm in Eugene, Oregon. If you didn't like today's show, research shows that it's probably because you skipped the planning phase. I'm on the social media platform formerly known as Twitter at ThatISPodcast, and Kevin is at KMKing_psych. All the comments and opinions expressed during today's show are our own. They are well-reasoned and insightful, and therefore are probably not endorsed by our grant funders or employers. Thanks for listening. On behalf of Kevin King and Lisa Saldana, we'll catch you next time.
all of us, I should have met this with you guys when I was having those really shitty days, because I actually am in a much better mood now than I
Nice.
was an hour and a half ago.